Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be taking a look at 5 different disturbing cold cases that were ultimately solved sometime this year. We will of course be going over some pretty messed up material, so viewers' discretion is advised. Without further ado, let's get into our first case. The case of Rita Curran is a very brutal one, with police unknowingly coming into contact with the culprit numerous times. But despite that, they were able to remain undetected for over 5 decades before ultimately being identified with a cigarette butt. Rita was 24 years old when she was tragically murdered in her apartment in Burlington, Vermont in the summer of 1971. At 1:30 a.m., the Burlington Police Department was notified by the fire department's ambulance crew of a woman that seemed to have been murdered. When police arrived, they confirmed that the young woman was deceased. Rita was living with 3 other roommates at the time, 24-year-old Beverly Lanfer, 19-year-old Carrie Duane, and 23-year-old Paul Robinson. Beverly told police that she and Rita shared a room. Beverly also said that she had been out late that night, and upon opening the bedroom door, she discovered Rita lying motionless on the ground with a heavily beaten face. Beverly then screamed out to her other roommates before contacting the medical center emergency room, telling them that she believed there was a dead person in the residence. It took about 3 hours for the medical examiners to finish inspecting the body. Dr. Harris reported that Rita was found on her back with her arms outstretched and her lower body propped up with her legs spread open. Rita's head was tilted left and badly beaten with numerous contusions and bruises covered in dried blood. It also appeared that strands of Rita's hair had been pulled out in the scuffle. There were also bruises along the inside of her leg, but none on her neck or torso. Furthermore, Rita was wearing a buttoned-up house coat that looked to have been forcefully ripped open, with several buttons strewn about on the floor. Her nightgown was entirely ripped and hung underneath her shoulder area. Her underwear was ripped from her body and located underneath her left leg. The culprit had somehow snuck into the room while Rita was lying down, where the two had a vicious fight on the side of the bed. The official cause of death was manual strangulation, and obviously she was SA'd. Around 7 a.m. the same day, officers began questioning the other residents who lived in the 3-story apartment complex. One of the residents who lived on the 3rd floor had said that they stayed up to around 1 a.m. but did not hear any unusual noises at the time, and the officer obtained similar statements from other residents that he visited. The 2 roommates, Paul and Carrie, later told another officer that they had returned to the apartment around 12:30 a.m. and hung out in the living room for a while before returning to their bedroom. When Rita's body was still being inspected inside the apartment, investigators located a Lark brand cigarette butt which was tucked underneath Rita's right elbow. The cigarette looked to have gone out naturally, with a small pile of ash laying around it. Investigators then asked the roommates if anyone smoked, and all of them said no. Police reported that there was no sign that the culprit had gone through the yard. The lead detective advised that everyone give the porch area a thorough search, as there may be blood left behind from the intense struggle. Neither the porch nor the driveway yielded significant leads though. The porch had a gray trash can which had been knocked over with the contents spread out on the ground. So most people likely suspect that one of, if not several of the roommates were responsible. Carrie said that both Paul and herself left the apartment just before 9 p.m. in order to get dinner. Beverly then decided to join the pair around 11:20 p.m. and she was the last person to see Rita alive who was in the apartment at the time. Once Beverly met up with Carrie and Paul, Paul said that he was beginning to feel tired, so he and Carrie decided to head back while Beverly stayed out. Carrie and Paul got to the apartment around 12:30 a.m. and didn't notice anything strange, but they did say that the door to Rita and Beverly's room was open by about 12 inches. Nevertheless, they didn't give it a second thought. Detectives suspect that Rita was murdered sometime after Beverly left the apartment and before Carrie and Paul returned. All of the roommates reported that their actions that night were spontaneous and they did not schedule anything ahead of time. In 2019, Detective Trieb was tasked with reopening the case, and he said that it was highly unlikely that this murder was a random chance encounter. The culprit only had about an hour to realize that Rita was the only one home, take her life, and then escape before the roommates returned. Trieb was quoted saying, "It is probable that the suspect lived in close proximity where he would have knowledge of who was home and when. He would have known who lived at the apartment and what vehicles they drove." So if you remember earlier, I mentioned that the officers went around the apartment to ask other residents if they had heard anything the night of Rita's death. Well, one of the residents was named William DeRoos, who lived on the 3rd floor. Police contacted William over 3 times, and he was also mentioned several times by other residents, saying that he was somewhat suspicious. But both he and his wife had solid alibis, which said that they were at home the entire night. One of the officer's reports said Mrs. DeRoos stated that she heard nothing and saw nothing, and as far as she knew, neither did her husband on the night of Monday, July 19th, 1971. William himself was never designated as a person of interest, and so he was never formally investigated. But due to his location, he was added to the pool of people to test DNA against once the case was reopened. Rita's fingernail scrapings as well as vaginal slides were sent to the New York City office of the chief medical examiners for testing. In about a month's time, a male DNA profile was generated with the cigarette butt that we mentioned earlier. And about half of the slides that were sent were deemed to have insufficient DNA for testing, but the fingernail scrapings were still being examined. So while that was being done, investigators took that DNA profile and began forming a list of suspects, which actually included Ted Bundy, but he was later eliminated from the list. All of Rita's roommates as well as the first responders also had their DNA tested against the profile, but they were also all ruled out from possibly being the culprit. In 2022, that cigarette butt was sent to Parabon Nanolabs. In addition to that, the company representatives asked for the list of people who had been ruled out as the culprit, and that William DeRoos that we talked about earlier was not on the list at first, but later on, Detective Trebe decided to add him back due to a gut feeling he had. Parabon later stated that William was a high confidence match with genetic matches on both the maternal and paternal sides of the family. However, William died in 1986 from a morphine overdose and his remains were cremated. Additionally, there was no biological evidence left behind that could be tested. But fortunately, they were able to locate a half-brother of William's and test the DNA against him. This test did confirm a familial relation. With this new revelation, authorities tracked down William's ex-wife, Michelle, who I believe has since changed her name to Kylis. They also visited all of Rita's former roommates, but by this time, Beverly had already passed away. In the 2022 interview with Michelle, she stated that William had never been physically abusive towards her and that she couldn't remember why she had broken up with William in the first place. Michelle informed the investigators that she didn't know who Rita was, and on the night that she was murdered, both herself and William got into an argument. Following that, William said he was going on a cool-down walk and left the apartment. Michelle added that she couldn't recall how long William had stepped out for, as she went to bed immediately after he left. Michelle claimed that she couldn't remember a lot of the details from that night since it was so long ago, but she did remember opening up her eyes to see William sleeping next to her at some point late into the night. In this interview, we also learned that William was a smoker. Furthermore, after he and Michelle had separated, William moved to Thailand to become a monk, which I believe he failed at. Around this time, William also got into another relationship, but this did not last long. In conclusion, due to the results of extensive DNA testing, the Burlington Police Department is more or less certain that William DeRoos is the sole perpetrator in Rita Curran's murder. Our next entry is a heartbreaking decade-old case where a child was murdered and went unidentified for years, and the way this case unfolds is pretty unexpected. On January 28, 2012, in Opelika, Alabama, a resident named Yvonne Johnson was out tenting to her backyard in the Brookhaven trailer park when she stumbled across a human skull. Yvonne recoiled out of fear and fled the area before contacting the police. Authorities didn't take long to arrive at the location, and after searching the area, they were able to find some more items strewn about. There was a pink long-sleeve shirt with heart buttons and ruffles, as well as human hair. The skull was later determined to have belonged to a 4 to 7-year-old African-American girl, and it is highly likely that the shirt belonged to her. While examining the skull, medical experts reported that the girl was malnourished and had a visible deformity in her left eye, but it is unknown whether that deformity was from natural causes or if it was sustained from injury or abuse. In addition to the clothing that was found, officers also discovered some other bones belonging to the child. On her arms, legs, shoulders, and ribs, there were numerous fractures, 15 of which were a result of blunt force trauma. Medical examiners estimated that the child had been deceased for several years before being discovered, but no matter how much research was done, authorities could not figure out who exactly the child was. There had been no missing persons reports in the area with a description that matched the details found, and after diving into both school and birth records, there were also no leads. For the time being, the public gave her the name Opelika Jane Doe. It wasn't until 4 years later in 2016 when officers got a meaningful lead. In September of 2016, there was a teacher who worked under a vacation Bible school that learned about the deceased girl from 2012 and provided some photographs of a child who attended the Bible school in 2011. This girl was about 4 to 5 years old at that time. This church was only about 10 minutes away from where Opelika Jane Doe was found. When police questioned the teacher for more details, they learned that the girl showed up with a somewhat unkempt appearance, with dirty clothes, messy hair, and an unpleasant smell. Furthermore, she struggled to communicate with the other kids and thus remained pretty quiet and isolated. To the officers' dismay, there wasn't an official registry of the children who attended the school, and the teacher couldn't remember her name, so investigators were yet again at a bit of a dead end. But based on this new information, authorities suspected that the girl came from a bad household with abusive parents/guardians who may have played a role in her death. In 2022, an advanced forensic sequencing lab was employed by the Opelika Police Department, and they were able to utilize the Jane Doe's remains to synthesize a more detailed gene profile to analyze. Furthermore, the police department sought help from other investigators, including a woman named Barbara Ray Venter, who was a skilled geneticist that assisted officers in identifying the Golden State Killer. With this newfound help, investigators were able to identify the Opelika Jane Doe as a girl named Amore Wiggins, and by finding her identity, officers were also able to subsequently find out the parents' identities as well. The father was a man named Lamar Vickerstaff, who at the time was serving in the Navy. Lamar's role was that of a chief engineman on the missile destroyer USS Jason Dunham. It would take several months, however, until police were able to question Lamar, and when they finally got the chance to speak with him, he was far from cooperative. After hours of questioning and no results to show for it, police gave up as it was clear that Lamar wasn't going to provide any information on his daughter. The police then attempted to meet with his wife at the time, Ruth, who had married Lamar in May of 2006. Ruth informed authorities that she was not the girl's biological mother and that she didn't know a single thing about the girl or who her real mother might be. With no more people to question, all police could do was wait while Dr. Barbara Ray Venter continued her work in trying to match Amore Wiggins' DNA to someone else other than Lamar. Fortunately, after some time, Barbara succeeded and obtained several matches, which she then narrowed down to a woman living in Maryland named Sharon Wiggins, who was 37 years old at the time. Police visited Sherry to gather information in December of 2022 and learned that Sherry gave birth to Amore on January 1st, 2006. Furthermore, we now know that Ruth, Lamar's new wife, was lying about not knowing who Amore was. Sherry provided authorities with legal documentation proving that Lamar and Ruth gained legal and physical custody of Amore in 2009. These documents also included the continuous child support payments that Sherry had been making since 2009. In addition to losing custody, Sherry was also suspended from visiting her daughter. Sherry had tried several times to go back to court in order to get the custody arrangements changed so that at the very least she could see her daughter, but those were never approved. Sherry had no idea that her daughter had gone missing up to that very moment and had never been to the Opelika area. Police contacted the school boards in several neighboring states and found that Lamar and Ruth had never enrolled Amore in any of the schools. Authorities also realized that the two never even reported Amore to be missing at any point. On January 17, 2023, both Lamar and Ruth were arrested after Ruth was pulled over for a traffic violation. Lamar was charged with felony murder and Ruth was arrested for failure to report a missing child. In court in March of 2023, Lamar claimed that he was not responsible for Amore's injuries leading up to her death and that he only lost her when he was driving from Virginia to Alabama. In the spring of 1972 in Boardman, Ohio, there was a 12-year-old boy named Brad Bellino who went missing and was later found dead in a dumpster. Brad was in 6th grade at the time and had a best friend named Don. Due to the approaching Easter holiday, the boys did not have school on one Friday afternoon, so they decided to spend some time roaming around town. By this point, Brad and Don had been on the same baseball team for the last several years, and Don's dad was even the coach of the team. Brad's parents both worked, so he was often left with no one to watch over him while at home. So his parents worked out a deal where Brad often went home with Don after school and even had dinner with his family. On those particular nights, Don's mom would drive Brad back home once Brad's parents were free. So back to that Friday afternoon on Easter break. After the boys got bored of running around town, they decided to go back to Don's house, which was located in a nicer upper middle class development. And as we just went over, the normal routine would be that Brad was driven back home by one of Don's parents. But on this particular day, they were both busy. Brad also knew that both of his parents wouldn't be free for quite a while, so he made the decision to walk back home by himself. By this time, it was around 7:30 p.m. and the walk back home was over 3 miles. And this was the last time Brad was seen alive. The details of what exactly happened to Brad after he left Don's house are unclear. Brad was known for being adventurous, but despite that, he was very punctual. So when he didn't return home on time, his family knew that something terrible had happened. It took several days for the family to receive any updates on Brad, and the news that they received was the worst case scenario. On the following Tuesday morning, April 4th, just over 8 a.m., Brad's lifeless body was located in a dumpster behind a dairy store that was 2 miles from Don's house. Brad's body was discovered covered by cardboard and waste with his shoes sticking up at an angle. His striped pants were undone and pulled down below his hips, and a belt was tightly fastened around his neck. Medical examiners determined that Brad's time of death was approximately 9 p.m. Saturday, April 1st, which was about 24 hours after he was last seen leaving Don's house. The official cause of death was strangulation, and there were clear signs that he was SA'd. Being so close to Brad, police thought that they could gather valuable information from Don. When questioned, Don recalled there being a brown van that seemed to have been following them around on the day that Brad went missing. Don said that they saw the van at least 4 times in different places, and at first they joked about it, but later got scared, and that was actually why they went home early that day. Don was quoted saying, "I think whoever was in that van waited until he was in a dark spot and took him." The identity of the culprit remained unknown for over 5 decades, but earlier this year, Parabon Labs was able to tie the DNA to various individuals with similar physical characteristics or family trees. The lab eventually narrowed the search down to a man who was 32 years old at the time of Brad's murder. This guy's name was Joseph Norman Hill. Eager to build on this new revelation, authorities rushed to look for family members of Joseph, and once they located one, they requested to test their DNA against his. After this test, the lab reported that there was a 98% chance that the unknown DNA found on Brad's clothing belonged to Joseph. But the thing is, Joseph actually died from cancer back in 2019, and to make matters worse, his body was cremated, eliminating the chance to confirm with 100% certainty that Joseph was the culprit. Investigators then dug into Joseph's personal life and found out that he was a truck driver that worked for a bottled water company. Additionally, there was no known connection between Joseph and any of Brad's family members. On the surface, Joseph seemed to be a pretty normal member of society, only ever having one run-in with law enforcement in 1968 where he was convicted of disorderly conduct. A prosecutor named Gina DiGenova was tasked with reviewing all of the evidence and information from Boardman police behind Brad's murder. Gina ultimately stated that after she and her team thoroughly reviewed all of the information in front of them, she was confident that she could convict Hill in front of a grand jury if he was still alive. Earlier this year, Brad's family said that they would like to be left alone while they process all of the new information, and thus have decided to not speak on the new updates. Over 2 decades ago, in the year 2000, a woman by the name of Sharon Anschutz was shot and killed in Greenville County in South Carolina. Sharon was both a wife and a mother who was raising 4 children while also working at John Butler Dry Cleaners. On the afternoon of June 5th, 2000, a customer visited the dry cleaning business to pick up his clothes, but noticed that the establishment was eerily quiet. He stood by waiting for an employee to come out front for service, but after a few minutes with no one showing up, he decided to look for help himself. But as he crossed the counter, he noticed a body sprawled out on the floor with blood gradually spreading across the ground. He immediately notified police and they showed up in minutes along with an ambulance. But unfortunately, too much time had passed and Sharon was long gone. Police immediately began investigating and noticed that the cash register was left open with all of its cash removed. After visiting the neighboring shops as well as some pedestrians, the police were left at a bit of a standstill as no one recalled anything out of the ordinary leading up to Sharon's murder. As the days passed and Sharon's family grieved, the police received several calls with details on the incident, but none of the leads led to any meaningful results. During this time, Sharon's family was also discussing possibly bringing her body back to Michigan, which is where she grew up, in order to have a special funeral service with all of her family. The case understandably went cold after investigators exhausted their list of suspects, but in the year 2022, Sheriff Hobart Lewis was able to take over Sharon's case. Hobart's first decision was to reanalyze the fingerprints that were lifted from the cash register, but this time to utilize the modern technology available. After several weeks, the team discovered that the prints belonged to an assortment of different people that worked at the dry cleaners, all except for one, that is. Hobart then ordered his team to revisit all of the old witnesses and shop owners, as well as some new people that he thought may have some valuable information. Hobart's main goal here was to try and identify an out-of-place man to match the prints up from the cash register. And luckily, one of those new people that they interviewed mentioned a person named Roger Keith Hudgens. Roger was a father and husband who served in the Air Force with no criminal record whatsoever. Those new witnesses that police visited stated that Roger often did odd jobs for locals and at times even took out the trash for the dry cleaning business. But just like with several of the other cases that we went over, Roger was already deceased by the time police suspected him of being the culprit. Roger died in 2008 from natural causes, and he would have been in his mid-40s when he murdered Sharon. Police suspect that Roger was originally intending on robbing the dry cleaners on one of the days when he was signed to take out the trash, but the gig went wrong and he decided to shoot Sharon in the back. In January of 2023, investigators officially stated that Roger was the gunman responsible for Sharon's death. Carol Joyce Deleon was born on February 18, 1963 in Bexar County to Rodolfo Deleon and Ramona Vara. Carol graduated from Thomas Edison High School in San Antonio, Texas on May 28, 1981, only to be tragically murdered days later. On the night of June 3rd, 1981, it is believed that she and a few friends visited a nightclub. However, it's a bit unclear what exactly happened to Carol on this night, but it was the last time that she was seen alive. The very next day, on June 4th, Carol's nude body was discovered along Interstate 35 near a rest area around 7:30 a.m. Her clothing had been pulled up behind her head and she had been shot in the head 6 times. Additionally, medical examiners reported that there was severe bruising around the victim's neck. And as is common with many of these cases, there were essentially no leads for authorities to go off of. So they scraped under Carol's fingernails for any foreign DNA that she may have retained from defending herself. And at the time when Carol's body was first discovered, police actually could not identify her. Investigators tried using her fingerprints as well as any active missing persons reports in neighboring areas, but there were no leads. Carol was buried as a Jane Doe in New Braunfels. It wasn't until around 2009 to 2010 that authorities discovered her identity as Carol Deleon. Police released photographs of Carol, which Carol's family eventually came across. At first, the family thought that it was unlikely that the girl was Carol, but nevertheless, they contacted police about possibly knowing who they were. Authorities then asked the family to submit DNA samples, which were tested and then ultimately matched up to Carol. At one point in the investigation, the notorious serial killer Henry Lee Lucas, who was responsible for at least 3 murders, confessed to killing Carol. But the thing about Lucas was that he was well known for giving out false confessions, having falsely confessed to over 250 murders. So because of that, investigators didn't take him too seriously. Nearly 3 decades later, in 2010, a new DNA lab was commissioned to assist in the investigation. Using the DNA that was scraped from Carol's fingernails all those years ago, they were able to generate a DNA profile. This profile identified the culprit as male, but the team failed at matching it to anyone in particular. And it took about another decade for any more significant progress in the case. Sometime in 2020, the DNA was submitted to an additional genealogy test, which brought up 3 possible suspects. One of the 3 was a man named Larry Allen West. Police visited Larry in his workplace in 2021 with an arrest warrant and requested that he submit DNA to be tested. And surprisingly, Larry did not refuse, but after the test, his DNA was matched to the profile that was generated and he was taken to Bexar County Jail with a bond set to $125,000. When questioned, Larry stated that he often visited bars near the area where Carol was found to pick up younger women, but he also said that he had nothing to do with Carol's murder and had never even seen the girl before. Authorities also visited old friends and the ex-wives of Larry, who all described the man as a very violent person. Larry's first wife told police that after she had married him, it was like she stepped into hell. She was only married to Larry for about 30 days before leaving, and in that time, she stated that Larry repeatedly abused and raped her. After hearing about this DNA match and the description of Larry as a person, Carol's family was looking forward to finally seeing someone get locked up for this crime. Carol's sister Sandra was quoted saying, "This is his chance before he leaves this earth to make his peace. Come forth, give the rest of the family peace. I know that justice is going to come in one form or another." And at the time of recording this script, Larry was actually released from jail after posting bail, but he will be back in court sometime this month for a pre-trial hearing. And of course, as of right now, he is still adamant that he had nothing to do with the murder. Hey y'all, if you made it all the way to the end of the video, thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed it, and as always, if you did, leaving a like would really help me out. I'm currently working on quite a few different videos, but I'll be back in a couple weeks with part 12 of the Unsolved Mysteries Iceberg. And there is a 99% chance that this video will be demonetized or get limited ads, which is basically the same thing. So I want to give a special thank you to all of my channel members for supporting me. Thank you so much to Flack, Hero, Devoured Eagle, Sasha Wise, -5 stars, Fear the Milkman, 0 to 9, and Jerome Reuter. I really do appreciate you guys being members month after month, so thank you all so much. If any of you guys would like to become a member, you can check out the first link in the description, which will also give you guys early access to each of my uploads regardless of which tier you pick. So I hope you all have an amazing day, and I'll talk to you all again very soon, and thanks again for making it all the way to the end.